Welcome to another episode of Bodha, the Dharmic lens of everything. It feels like there is a lot happening around us, from wars to tariffs to relationships between nations to discourse within the Hindu civilizational world. There is a lot of animated debate around what are the ideas that help us move forward. Who are the thinkers? What are the ideologies? How should we look at a combination of nation, civilization, spirituality? So, a lot of this, but we perhaps do not have the ability to unpack it all at once. And for that, we turn to our masters, our spiritual gurus, who are able to put this in perspective for us. So, I'm very grateful that we have Ramachandra ji, who's been guiding Brihat right from day one. Ramji, thank you, and Jai Guru. I wanted to have this conversation with you at a time when I think all of us are really grappling with ideas and the consequences of ideas. Right? It's easy to get animated. It's a little bit more difficult to get clarity around this. So I wanted to discuss a few themes around around everything that's happening in the world today, but also look at it both from the macro perspective. Whenever we talk about civilization, global futures, ideologies, and national strategy, but also what happens what happens within the sphere of the individual, right? As a emotional being, as a spiritual being, as a psychological being, and what is the relationship? How do you reconcile both of these things? I wanted to get some perspective from a dharmic spiritual lens on how we can approach this, right? And for our viewers to have a way to look at the debate, not just within the frame of civilization and nation and ideologies and opposing temperaments, but also evolution itself of the human. Right? How do we look at this and how do we understand? And what are the macro forces that govern human evolution? Right? And I want to begin there, firstly, on what is being called the metacrisis. Now, this is not a new word. It's been called polycrisis. It's been called metacrisis. Fundamentally, invoking the sense that these are not disparate, amorphous, unrelated crises. It's not that economy is separate from ecology, which is separate from well-being, which is separate from war. It is a set of interconnected crises, and therefore there is a relationship at a meta level between all the things that are unfolding at this time. There have been many thinkers who have articulated this. Daniel has articulated, John Verweek has articulated. They call it polycrisis in sustainability literature. So we are told that we are in a world now where multiple crises have converged. Right? How should we understand this? How should we even frame this? Begin to framing this from a dharmic lens.
From a dharmic lens. So, um, just see, I am not super familiar with this very sophisticated vocabulary, which keeps, by the way, keeps defining and redefining and changing itself, and gets inflated, and something gets added. So last time when I checked and asked, because anyhow our intelligence seems to be outdated and we are invoking and evoking artificial intelligence. So last time when I checked on artificial intelligence, what is this meta crisis, I think you have summed it up well, but for my own benefit and also for the people who are listening to us, I would like to read out what one of the AI, they have artificial intelligence has given a good definition of meta crisis, I think. So, okay, maybe I'm not exactly finding it, but the thing is, it broadly states something like it's a complexity of several crises coming together. It is foundationally it comes at the crisis of purpose and meaning. That is what is being defined as, but in it is nested economic crisis, technological crisis, theological crisis, spiritual crisis. I don't know what other things we can basket them into that, and all of this is there. But what I have always felt, the advantage of having um, dharmic stories, or stories, or the way our itihasa and puranas are encrypted, have encrypted within them the wisdom. they are not as mm, abstract, symbolic, or kind and compassionate as we want to be. Because when we want to use words like crisis, it still feels harmless, you know. It just feels like some sort of a phenomena is happening. It's like very impersonal. Some sort of a process is taking place, something like that. There has to be a sense of urgency. There has to be pinch. There, yeah, there has to be almost a somatic sensation in the urgency and the immediacy of something that is unraveling, and you just call it crisis. Somehow I think either because of the vocabulary of English, it doesn't probably bring such kind of urgency.
Actually, yeah, it doesn't help you register cognitively the urgency of
It
this.
doesn't. And so let us make it urgent. We have to, if you have to make it urgent, I would like to use the word, our word, which is Visha. Poison. Poison. It's what is happening is poisoning. Okay. So now there is immediacy, there is urgency. You know, we are not philosophizing it, we are not decorating it with various perspectives, abstracts. Poisoning is happening. It's a process that is unfolding, and therefore, what typically how then you will have to ask about how does poison work. You know, so poison works by inflicting, depending on the intensity of the poison, it eventually leads to dysfunctionality. So if you typically associate poison with, what will you associate poison with? You'll associate with reptiles or snakes, right? And this is what we say. And I'm a student of life sciences, and there was a phase in my life when I was studying life sciences. I was fascinated with the snakes and the types of poisons. When I earliest period, when I discovered that each snake has a specialization in poison. One is, you know, nervous system, one dysfunctions nervous system, one affects the blood circulation, one affects, so various systems, you know. So each poison seems to be having a different kind of an effect, or affecting systems, you know, in a different way. And what is it, how is it affecting? It is making the system dysfunctional existing. So it is because our life can be articulated also as systems and processes, and the poisoning that we are experiencing is causing very tangible, palatable, experiential dysfunctionality in each of the systems. And we have wide variety of poisons, okay, and each of them have infused themselves, you know, into various layers of our experience of life. Because of this, there is crisis. That is the sense of urgency, you know, I'm trying to bring to this. And one of the best things, the way we have done, we have, like you have, how you have metacrisis, which is the sum total of all the crises, you know, as articulated. The sum total of all the poisons is meta poison, which is what comes across in our great Puranic story, where, you know, you would call it Halahala, and sometimes even the serpent which is spilling it out as the Kalakuta. In the process of living, our age-old wisdom has encrypted in its stories that between the churning which is pulled by the, you know, forces of darkness and light, the spillover of the poison is inevitable. So here we are not somebody unfamiliar with the nature of the poison. We have integrated the poison generation mechanism as inextricable and inseparable to the process of living itself or creation. So, how you cannot conceive of creation without conceptualizing the action and the stamp and the impressions of forces of light and darkness. Similarly, you cannot conceptualize of creation without having the impact of the Visha and poison. right? So this is what I would articulate. Crisis is we are going through pretty intense phase of poisoning.
We've compounded our
Yeah.
ability to.
And I liked what you alluded, in one of the initial remarks, um, was the pace at which the crisis is unfolding versus the pace at which we are able to make sense, or sense making process seems to be too,
The gap is wide.
gap is too widening, and it is like compounding gap. This is also very similar to the poisoning process. Poisoning also has a very little time limit, after which there is a point of no return. Then the skin turns blue, all the indications come, and then the poison is entering into the systemic cycles. It is now getting into the tissues, it is now getting very much into the bloodstream, so whatever its root of dysfunctionality it takes. So there is time, kala becomes extremely. So there is a reason why it is kala kuta visham. That is a visham, or the poison, which is connected with the aspect of kala. So if you do not arrest it in time, then it becomes irreversible. Therefore, we seek to the presence which is divine to arrest it. And therefore, we go to Lord Shiva in the story and then we pray. We are getting totally poisoned from all sides. This poison has emerged from the creation. Please do something. And he very kindly consumes it. And he in turn arrests it. He has a unique ability of consuming it and holding it and arresting it in a way that he holds it at a level where the karmendriyas, or the whole functionality, is not dysfunctional, and he holds it at that level, and it is very painful holding. The process is very painful. It is not romantic, it is not beautiful, it is not aesthetic, it is none of that. Anyone who experiences this process, which we experience, everyone in our own measure, as an individual, as a collective, as a nation, we experience this, because it is so archetypally templated, this truth, that it is inescapable. Everybody experiences this. Take whatever is the unit of consciousness you want to take: individual, couple, household, family. A disruptive, dysfunctional family in the household, where mother and father are at their peak of expressing their emotions and impulses with a certain level of Visha, poison, it becomes very harmful for the child. And the child is left to the exposure in this. So this,
It's like radiation in the
exactly. So then this turns into dysfunctional family, that as a unit. So this experience, I feel there are many metaphors that can be given. I like poison very much in that sense. So because then we are not sweet, we are not sweet coating it. We are coming straight to the point.
So, from a dharmic perspective, our problem solving approach itself will be very different, because we look at this as a living organism. We look at, and what you mentioned also reminds me of how Ayurveda treats. It looks at there is a balance, and that balance has been vitiated, and the treatment has to restore that balance. So the capacity of the organism itself has to increase to hold, in this context, the highest capacity of Shiva, like you mentioned, to hold it. So from that perspective, firstly, at what levels? There is an intellectual level where this dialogue is happening. Then there is a social anxiety around it. Are people socially cohesive? Because a lot of, within, at least within our national discourse, a lot of solutioning uh, is uh, is presented in a manner that pits the social against the spiritual. And then there is also the dimension of national growth and strategy. For example, economics is pitted against tradition. Now, we seem to have gotten into this binarization process. Whereas what you mentioned just now is the ability to hold all of these things integrally, where the capacity of the system, whether it's an individual or a family or a nation, there is inherent capacity building to hold these polarities together, which is when the crisis does not compound, which is when the opposites can be reconciled. So there is this anxiety now, and because there is also the ability to express, and there is technology to compound that expression, it seems to be generating no the opposite of building capacity, right? It seems to be generating anxiety that the problem is escalating, and we are not able to do anything. So how should we look at this? What does this capacity generation process involve?
Yeah. So, I will continue the metaphor now that I have invoked that metaphor, and I think it has still a lot more to offer to us, exactly in the kind of articulation that you have done. And in my view, is that first of all, we need to understand, do we have methods, mechanism, no matter. Let us not call something dharmic, adharmic, or anything for that. What we are saying, it's poisoned, right? The system is poisoned. What we are asking is the basic question: do we have diagnostics to detect the poisoning, that it has been poisoned, and to determine the levels and the intensity of the poisoning? This becomes a very commonsensical approach. um, how traditional dharmic wisdom can provide its diagnostic tools, are they more subtle, more perceptive? This is where we can come to. And uh, as soon as there is something, also the other way to look at it is, I think this is the inherent way of a Bharatiya way of looking at it. As soon as something has an ability to detect the poison and to do the right diagnosis, by doing so it becomes dharmic. As soon as something is able to offer that level of a diagnosis, means we are immediately adoring, acknowledging the inherent capacity of detection and viveka in the process of diagnosis. We are not attached to so much attached to the forms and the phraseology. We are the ones who are the Gnana Parampara, people from Gnana Parampara. So as soon as their knowledge lights up in any part of the globe and any part of the human consciousness, we are expected to have the recognizing ability.
That is the maturity of the.
Yes. So therefore, first and foremost, in the process of understanding the crisis or this, A, recognizing it's getting poisoned, B, recognizing the ability to diagnose the process. What happens is, as soon as you diagnose it, the common sense next is, this is poison, stop consuming it. That's as simple, no? How can you sit and keep eating poison? How can you sit and keep watching poison? How can you sit and keep breathing poison with these indriyas, the consumption modes? Then do we have intelligence and ability to restrain, constrain, and put necessary pause? And this is an extremely important aspect in my way of looking at it, and when I am contemplating on it, and where our dharmic perspectives gives this a beautiful framework, I would say. So do you have in you, or in your culture, in your system, this encouragement, inherent encouragement, to stop consuming poison? So what is your inherent poise of restraint? Next, what is the common sense thing that you will do? That you have diagnosed the poison, there is poison, first you recognized it. There is a huge problem here. Poison is not being recognized that as poison. So I am saying there is a foundational issue over there. Why there? What is the epistemology? The problem of epistemology, or I would say how the epistemology itself has got poisoned. This is something that I would leave it for later part of the discussion. But recognizing that there is poisoning happening, then recognizing the diagnosis, then bringing the common sense of, "Arey, don't consume poison." Okay. Then what do you do next? How do you protect yourself from poison? Protection mechanisms have to come into the picture. So what is the cultural intelligence that you have? What is the collective intelligence that you have? What is the individual or family as a unit intelligence that you have? How you as an individual have been inculcated and evoked with or infused with the benefits of uh, recognizing this uh, aspect of not to consume poison and protect yourself from consuming of the poison, this aspect, right? So I also allude to some of the good intellectual thinkers from Dharmic side who have used the phraseology of poison pills, and all of this has so this has happened sometime. I think it's a significant way of looking at it. I also allude to it to some extent. So then you need to simply have the ability to protect yourself from not letting your systems and processes, sum total basically your life or your kshetra, not getting poisoned. So that means the sense of protection has to be there. What is protection? Is it some abstract phenomena? What is the common sense way of looking at protection? Alertness. Do you have alertness or not? And then for whatever measure of poisoning has already occurred, whatever measure of already impact has occurred, do you have sheltering mechanism? For protection also you need sheltering, and for those who have been impacted you also need sheltering for healing. So basically do you have a robust sheltering mechanism in your systems, in your life, in your kshetra, in your conceptualization of culture, to shelter people? Do you have it? Do you have healing capacity? Next, obviously, that is what you need. Then you have what you spoke about, capacity to restoration, rejuvenation, and revitalization. All of this has to happen. So, and what I allude to here is one of the biggest problems is coming at the, we have our Taittiriya Upanishad, right? It provides the two birds sitting, a metaphor of the two birds sitting on a tree and on a branch, and one bird on a higher altitude, probably, I think, and on the higher branch, looking at the one which is very busy eating the fruit, which is busy eating, which is busy consuming. So within our psyche, we naturally harbor the poise of involvement. We, so consumption is nothing but the symbology, symbolical way of saying that we are involved in life. How are we involved in life? Through bhoga, through rasa, being a rasika. So you have various levels of involvement, through at an action level you are involved, at a thinking level you are involved. Unless you are involved, how will you build up relationships? So it is essentially expected of you to have this poise of involvement. This is what is alluded as Kshara Purusha, the one which is involved. The one which is not involved and which is always looking, it appears to be passive observer, but it's not passive. But it is an observer nevertheless. It becomes the Akshara Purusha, which is not in, it's in the spectrum of involvement. It is least involved, or it has an ability for not consuming. Right now, when the whole systems and processes are poisoned, you need to invoke that. You cannot justify, keep saying that I want to involve and I need to keep partaking only. That is stupidity, isn't it? So as soon as any solution is being provided to you, it doesn't matter from where it is coming in. As soon as any solution that is being provided to you, from a dharmic lens, it is your responsibility to understand how it is meant for hita, right? And then you will immediately see that despite poisoning process and all of that, is this solution encouraging us for consumption, or is it now asking us to be little more restrained, not completely famished? I'm not saying that. What happens is, in the process of detecting this whole process of detecting the poison and then coming to the point of having the common sense of not consuming, no, and then we said having the alertness of protection. Alertness is more associated not with involvement, it is associated with sakshi bhava. Unless there is a sakshi tattva which is matured enough in you, your state of alertness is not there. This is what our basic ABCD of our spirituality, Adhyatma, wants to introduce in our lives.
The power, the capacity.
Capacity to observe, capacity to not get swayed, this is being encouraged. So, not to say that remain detached, to say that when you are partaking, there should also be something in you which is witnessing the process of partaking. So that this witnessing allows for alertness, wisdom, common sense, all these things to flow.
And not attaching identity.
Yeah, so that is identity, though it's like full-fledged, involvement. It's like it goes deep into indulgence and whole lot of things. And then you become addicted. This is addiction is in the same spectrum of involvement. You are just going into a totally different end altogether, right? You are saying that not only I have to partake, that if I don't partake, I cannot live. You are telling it's poison. I said it's okay. Even if it's poison, I need to partake.
I'm a foodie.
Yeah, something like that. You have great deal of modern day, postmodern or modern cultural normalizations which justify this, and that's the reason when people are sent to more wise healing methods like Ayurveda, first what Ayurveda says is it sees what are you consuming, and then it says, we call it in Telugu paityam or something like that. No, like just refrain. Don't eat, don't consume. Just try. First of all, at least give a pause to what you have been consuming. Then let me observe how your system is responding.
Ahar, vihar, vyavahar, and vichar. All at 4 levels.
All at 4 levels, you have to have the ability to do the upavasa. To refrain, to be. So I think this is very, very essential. This aspect.
I want us to also just recognize, as part of a global world, what is making this difficult, because this cultural intelligence has been there. It is embedded into our languages, it is embedded into our festivals, it is embedded into our rituals. But I see 3 forces which are sort of intersecting and compounding each other, which is making this process of observation itself very difficult. The first is the compounding of desire through digital technologies, which is, if our rate of desire production was X in the pre-social media era, because we are also learning our desire by consuming what is being presented to us. Right? So that rate of top of the funnel introduction itself has compounded so much more. Right? We are living in that, and therefore your indriyas in some ways are on steroids, and that also means that your sense making is on a ventilator, because the capacity to observe, how much would you observe, because the velocity and the frequency and the density has increased. So that's one. Second is this belief that you only live once. So there is also a metaphysical justification to this. Not only are desires increased, but there is also this belief being seeded in every single aspect of culture, whether it is advertising, whether it is product design, whether it is office and corporate culture. Every single interface that we have is giving us this feedback that this is your life and you only live once. So desires have increased, and at the same time our ability to play the infinite game, saying that in this lifetime I can probably do this, that kind of wisdom has diminished, because there is incessant culturalization of this idea of one life. And at the third level, you are also led to believe that not only are the desires more, not only is it freedom to chase those desires, not only do you live once, so therefore there is an urgency to chase those desires, but it is possible to consume those desires by taking debt, or by having some other mechanisms which give you the illusion that you can afford it right now, right, as a culture. Right? So there are, from technology to metaphysics to economic design, there are structural forces which are influencing our or diminishing our ability to observe. How do we, from our lens, how do we actually look at this? Is this something to, uh, the poison in that sense? Poison is multiplying through multiple means. At a psychological level, it is giving you this anxiety that you only live once. At an economic level, it is giving you this false illusion that you can afford this. And at a technology level, it is multiplying the number of avenues through which you consume that poison.
If I were to correlate the urgency with which we brought the sense of poisoning, and the process of poisoning, if I were to uh, immediately somehow take this observable experiential phenomena that we are all experiencing, directly put it at the doorstep of differences in theological views. So there are certain theologies which believe they are only living ones, and there is also atheism which also subscribes to something like this. So it is only material. Um, at this point, to establish such a correlation between the poisoning that we are experiencing and this as a causality, I think it's a little more too complex. So for the sake of what I would try to stick, and then probably we will arrive at it, that particular way of looking definitely affects our epistemic, uh, you know epistemic way of looking, epistemic way of living, as well as generation of knowledge, and then therefore lifestyles and all of that. And at this point in time, I would say that has a greater vulnerability to poisoning process. But what I am saying here is, again, because if we enter into that conversation, there is a high chance that we might miss out the altitude of immediacy and suddenly climb to a very high altitude conversations, and then lose the somatic experience of poisoning. Like literally it is around. If there is suddenly a pollution out here for me to reflect upon whether it is because of I have a faith that I live many times, versus this pollution is happening because I do not have faith that there is no rebirth. It might still have its place. It has its place in a way that it can render us vulnerable in many different ways, in a very deep ways, that I am not taking away. But what I'm looking at, the immediacy and sensation, what I'm saying is that this sense of despondency, this sense of angst, this sense of fear, this sense of confusion, this sense of aggressive competition, all of this, that what we have articulated, is being amplified by the technological compounding. However technology compounds all of these have high value currency for the process of poisoning. What I'm saying is there is immediacy to this. There is a purchase for it. There is immediacy to this, and this immediacy is like it is experienced at every level. There is a huge deal of incentive of sustaining your attention in this zone of despondency and angst. So what I'm saying is poisoning has not happened.
It's a self-selection.
Poisoning has happened. I'm not saying that poisoning is somehow a process of life. I'm not alluding to it either that way, that it is part of life. I'm saying there is intentionality. There is agency standing behind this. If this recognition has to be, there is no way you can evade this. Who, what, all of that is next matter. But to recognize that there is agency, and that agency has urgency, and it's powerful. It is like, if I don't know if, for the sake of atheist empathetic, being empathetic to atheist, I don't know if God is omnipotent or not, but this agency seems to be omnipotent in unleashing the despondency, anger, fear, and whole our angst and all of this. So time and again there seems to be this necessity to ensure that you generate fear, somehow you alleviate it or suppress it here or heal it here, it comes up somewhere else. So that sort of a robustness of the system has been now built up.
Can shape shift.
Earlier, what used to happen is that because we were not so intensely interconnected, assume that when this kind of environment was prevailing in some part of the globe, there were other cultures who were not exposed to this level of anxiety, and so you can hypothetically think like that, no? But now the infection and the contagion of this kind of a negative, currency is widespread, and we are we are all intricately interdependent and interconnected, and so therefore we are all impacted at one go. I think that is one of the most biggest differences vis-a-vis. So for any particular circumstance you ask now, oh, is there discrimination in the society? Oh, but there was discrimination then also. Is there some injustice right now in the society? Oh, there was injustice then. All that is true, but now we are so deeply interconnected, so deeply affected together in this. So this is kind of, I think, unparalleled or unprecedented in that sense. At least commonsensically, this is what we think. Now, what happens is this intense, sustained exposure to this situation. What is it resulting in? This is an important diagnosis to be done, right? And we will do it from dharmic perspective. For us, I think crisis can be very well articulated, poisoning can be very well articulated and contextualized in the framework provided by our cycles of yuga or dharma. What is happening? Decline of dharma is happening, right? That is where we are putting our bet on the table. Instead of articulating it in any other way, that it would become increasingly difficult to practice dharma. So what is happening is this sustained exposure to these high currency values on despondency, angst, fear, confusion, and all of that is eventually leading to a situation, in my view, where there is erosion, atrophy, decline in our capacity to have faith on the higher power. This is sum total, okay? There is no I don't want to make it sound anything more abstract. Our ability to have faith, our ability to rely upon higher forces, our ability, whether it is a abstract higher force such as truth, light, wisdom, blah, 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 or it is embodied higher force in the form of the devatas or, Bhagavan in our way, our ability. And this happened to me experientially in one of my recent interviews, and I was having conversation with somebody. So a youngster from one of the university came, and this was I was having conversation with a Zen master, and we were talking about Zen and method. And Zen, by the way, of all the spiritual practices, it seems like it's such a simple way of sitting. You're just sitting, that too facing the wall. And she asked a very pertinent question, the way she articulated, while the whole world is burning at the back, I am turning my back to the burning world and sitting in front of the wall. And how are you expecting me to? There is this angst in me. So this was such a poignant moment for me to observe, because here was a youngster who was completely like embroiled, engrossed, and she wants to face the wall and sit and look into herself, but her vision is all the time calling towards the burning world. And so this is what I mean to say. Here is somebody who wants to connect to the higher force, but the currency of despondency and angst is always making her turn away and against from it, right? So I think this is very pertinent way of looking at it. First, it is depleting our capacity, it is eroding our faith in the higher power, and this sustained way of doing it. And this particular erosion of faith in the higher power and our ability to connect with the higher power and our reliance to connect with the sacred, and to be embedded in the sacred, to enshrine sacred in our lives, eroding of this capacity is not equivalent to simple atheism what we experienced over past centuries. This is extremely important. That is where I want to draw the distinction, that earlier also, either because I have a loss in my family, where is God when I had loss, so therefore I don't believe in God, is a sense of atheism that is emerging from my context of my experience of life. Vis-a-vis, there is another flavor of atheism. Just show me empirically what is divine, etc., etc. So therefore, there is no empirical experience of divine, evidence of divine. So therefore, I do not believe. These two trends did not necessarily land up into a perverted space of intentional poisoning. There was some still human strand which was still within ambit of their axis. They would articulate. So that is where a lot of 17th century, 18th century humanism with rationality and all of that came into picture, where human is enshrined as the divine. Forget whether divine is there or not, but humanism is there. So let's do something for the humanism. I would say it is a more vulnerable altitude as opposed to the sacred, what sacred gives, as opposed to, but yet it is not in the dungeon of the poisonous system. This particular erosion is an intentional angst, intentionally being pushed, and this poisoning is very, very intent driven. So that is the reason I want to make a very strong distinction, as opposed to uh, atheism as we have known for centuries, and we have adapted to cohabit with them and also engage with that kind of an attitude. It is not a big, anomaly in that sense for us, versus this evil turn of the situation where there is an intentionality. So this is where I think, and if I were to, and I think for the benefit of this conversation, where I'm going at is that eventually dharmic solution, or no matter how we are conceptualizing our solutions, have to have the ability to counterbalance this currency of despondency and anxiety, and somehow stop this breaking down or atrophy and erosion of having our ability to rely on something, sacred, our connection with the sacred. This needs to happen, and at the same time provide us uh, the potencies of creative and integrative forces. This has to come into picture. Now, I would say creative, integrative. If we were to talk the language of Sri Aurobindo, then evolutionary also. That comes into it. So this has to, this becomes necessity for human societies to move in, and this, in my view, dharmic views and where engagement with the sacred, enshrining sacred, living in sacred, these systems have natural tenacity and solutions and wisdom to offer more. They have a lot to offer, on these lines.
So I want to just summarize the journey that we've taken in this conversation so far. We recognized that there is an articulation of a confluence of different crises, right? And how that's being formulated. We also recognized how the formulation itself can obfuscate. It makes it impersonal, it makes it distant. And therefore, you began with, giving us a different articulation of that, which is closer home, which is actually cognitively as well, creates a sense of urgency and proximity to it. And we spoke about these structures, and we also spoke about the temperaments within this. And finally, we also brought it down to a lifestyle. How do we actually, what is the difference between a lifestyle that can build such capacity and resilience, and what are the missing elements in this? I wanted to bring it back to that element of poisoning. Clearly, there are sources of this poisoning, and if it has to be dealt with by an individual, there is some inner capacity that has to increase. Right? How should we characterize this?
So, I'm glad that we came back to that point, because after touching upon so many other nuanced aspects, again bringing it back to the immediacy of this, the Visha aspect of the Visha, because what is happening is that, as I have said, this sustenance of angst, despondency, fear, confusion. While one of the outcomes it is leading to is erosion of our ability to connect with the sacred. That is a very palpable outcome culturally for us. I think we are articulating it from a Bharatiya perspective. So for Bharatiya perspective, the sacred is the central currency for us, and that's why we keep telling Adhyatmikta. And so when that disconnection is happening, or when there is an erosion of that capacity to connect with the sacred is happening, that is a matter of a big concern for us. What it is also doing is this sustained pressure of this negative currency of angst, despondency, and all of that is completely crumbling the psychological architecture what we have in the first place. And if we say architecture, then again we imagine some sort of a building or something like that, some sort of a home. But let us make it for the design perspective. What it is crumbling and what it is doing is it is actually affecting the patra in which we are holding the whole life. The patra is you as a being, or it is the patra is in which whatever you are pouring, we used to partake. So our vision of sacred was the patra. Now this we have gradually changed. So changing because of the changing circumstances is one thing, because the tenacity of the sacred is so much so that no matter what outer forms and change you give, it still finds its way of anchoring us. That is the beauty of the divine. Just because you and me do not believe, the divine doesn't vanish out of the picture. So if that was the case, then we would never call it the sacred. So that is our dharmic way of looking at it, right? The Atman means that is that which is not, that which cannot be any further destroyed. That is the truth. That aspect is getting affected as the patra. However, we can think about a possibility that the divine which has enshrined in the patra, of this patra, of the individual or whatever is the unit that needs to hold, that can retreat definitely, leaving the patra vulnerable for changing its character and nature. The patra itself can become poisonous. What then happens is, no matter what content you pour in that cup, you can give the most healthiest of the thing, but it's as if like it comes in contact with the poison. So only poison you will be able to consume in that. So what is happening is the poisoning of the kshetra, poisoning of this being, poisoning of this, eventually the breaking down of the psychological architecture, putting immense pressure of our disconnect with the sacred. All of these multiple aspects are resulting, the poisoning is resulting in the patra itself, the container itself is getting poisoned. And that is the poisoning of your chitta, poisoning of your mental being, emotional being, vital being, the nature of the desires, the kind of the desires that are emerging now seem to be very, very different, unfamiliar. That's what I mean to say. And concoction, which is like a new potion that is being offered to you, that you do not know anything about. And you are rendered, you are kept in a space of decision making with your vulnerable viveka, that despite knowing, you are partaking it without having the ability to even question what would be the consequences. The rupture in viveka, I would always say the measure of viveka is there are many ways to look at what is viveka, and one of the simplest way, that somebody has viveka means you just simply look at their ability to control their speech. Okay, niyantrana on the speech, how you are speaking, what's coming, how you are expressing and what is coming out of it. That is the one aspect of the buddhi at a speech level. Another aspect of the buddhi is simple way to look at buddhi is the robustness of establishing cause and effect to a given circumstance or a situation. If I hand over a situation and a problem to you, like all this metacrisis and all that, and then how you go about establishing the cause and effect. Like in good old days in our management courses, they used to teach us that fishbone diagram, a root cause analysis. This is caused by this is caused by this. But as soon as the diagnosis becomes more and more intimate and subjective, the chances that you are going to put the right causes as the diagnosis is it keeps reducing or diminishing.
Thank you. I think this vocabulary itself is very important, and I wanted to share some observations that in the team also that we've been discussing when we talk about culture and cultural phenomena. But this idea of patra, the receptacle itself, being unable to hold anything good also given to it, but there is a seeking. While the capacity is coming down, the recognition or the yearning that there is something missing or there is a void is also simultaneously growing. So there's a difference between your ability to hold and the awareness of what you're missing, and that is itself also leading to what you mentioned as the breakdown of the psychological architecture. One way that we've seen this, and this is actually indicative of the macro phenomenon, all of these micro actions are leading to, is if you look at the Kumbh Mela, all the numbers and the kind of interest it generated in a lot of young people as well, travel and experiencing it and wanting to be a part of it. One of the things that we are seeing in all of the content and cultural experiences that we also are involved in is that there is a lot of interest in this self-expression, right? And it is finding some anchors, or it wants to express itself spiritually, but at the same time it wants to have that agency or that exclusivity of the self, of the individual. So when we look at Kumbh Mela, for example, it is the individual going and taking part in that, which is a very, very personal, very individualized experience, because you are going into the water, the flesh and bone is touching there, but that is fulfilled only in the collective. You can do it any other day, but you're doing it at that time, it's feeling so visceral, it's feeling so urgent. And this we are seeing in the kind of congregations that are happening around bhajans now in the cultural scene. People are now once again looking at kirtans. So it's very, it seems to be that both these things are playing out. There is the breakdown of the psychological architecture, but there is also a seeking of some experiences where this has to find some kind of fulfillment. And if you're not finding it, then the whole void is increasing. So this psychological part of it, I wanted you to explain this a little bit more on what do you mean by psychological architecture, and in the context of culture, I'm seeing it as people seeing experiences which are fulfilled in collective, but there is something happening within. How do we understand? How do we characterize that?
So, I think first I will address this a good observation that you have made about, while we have articulated well about the decline of the Dharma and how the poisoning is happening and how dysfunctionality is being induced, how there is currency for inflicting despondency, dejection, and all of that. While all of that is true, it is also true the fact that there is seemingly a reawakening of the need for reconnection or kind of rooting back, and
Whether they're calling it that or not is a different.
that's a different thing. Yeah. But this is also there, but this is for these are not at all, neither do I see them as contradictory movements, nor do I see them as an anomaly, unrelated or anything. I simply see this, we can contextualize this in the in the space of Shrishti Sthiti Laya. So all of the dark articulation what we have done of the decline of dharma is in a way it's like a laya, right? So even when Srishti is happening, right, there is and then when the sthiti is going to happen, let us understand though it is cyclical, and it is also like it might appear linear. First Srishti has happened, then Sthiti has happened. So it is also cyclical, because then Laya is happening in a way. So Srishti is creation, Sthiti is sustenance, and Laya is dissolution, let's say. When this is happening, the tail end of the Srishti, there is a huge overlap with the commencement of the Sthiti. So there is a phase, and what we call, like, we can equate it with the Sandhya, where the horizon, there is and this is there especially in this particular aspect of this overlaps, the liminal spaces, one can call it, like the thresholds, like how Narasimha Deva, Sri Mahavishnu as Lord Narasimha, chooses not nor the day nor the night, not outside, not inside, but at the threshold, intersection. So these intersection points are points filled with tremendous potential and possibilities. This is extremely important to remember, these intersection points. And not many get to experience collectively the intersection points. Like, probably if you look at 500-600 years ago, or maybe let's say 1000 years ago, or maybe 1500 years ago, we were in a bit of an upswing probably. Then if you tell them you are an intersection point, there is going to be decline like this. If you were to articulate all that what we are experiencing back then, this is going to be, they would not even make head or tail of it in a way. They would still know that dharma would decline. That is the reason we have Veerabrahmendra Swami Garu and all of them, when they articulated, they gave certain indications.
But that is at a macro aggregate level.
Yeah. So, but what I'm saying is that we as a collective, I think there is no doubt that all wise people are articulating this, that there seems to be like a transition point also at the same time. So this kind of, I would like to place this rekindling and reawakening possibility into our own roots or our own soil in a way, and redefining ourselves is like probably a very, very early primers of a sort of a Nutana Srishti in a way, while the decline is fast going. So that is the reason I would say here those who get too anxious about our sense making is not at the pace at which the decline is happening. They find a sort of optimism when they suddenly are told, here are the new dawns appearing with their first rays on the horizon, and this could be considered that. And we can be cynical about it. There is no, because the twilight is the phase of cynicism, where anything that you would see, that you would think that whether it is good or bad, you don't know. And depending on who is influencing your mind, even if the God comes right now in front of you, you will find fault with the God. That is the power of the twilight, so the Sandhya. So that is the reason we had one Devata Sandhya, one we have Asura Sandhya. How beautiful, that our conceptualization of the culture could really consider these twilight zones, in these beautiful ways. Yeah, so you have the tendency that who is influencing your mind during this twilight is what matters. So in that sense, I feel this reawakening and this rekindling and this re-emergence possibility can be definitely considered as a positive. So much so that we might want to label all these younger generations with heavy labels as woke, Gen Z, and whole lot of things we might want to, put on them these burdens of the labels, and disappoint them, or we feel disappointed. Good part about these people, this generation, is the part of their mind is so entitled that they're like, they don't care about your opinion in that sense. So this is also there in that sense. I remember, we both visited and interacted with youth camp in Oroville, and that was kind of revelatory for me, because I also had this experience. I also had this impression that, oh, most of this Gen Z is nothing but Instagram oriented. They want selfie. They are capturing themselves again and again in the context, in the changing context. Somehow that aspect of turning towards themselves seems to be, we unfortunately use heavy words such as narcissism and all of that, and this is the
And I want to address that also next
exactly,
about this
I think,
literature that psychology and
yeah,
psychotherapy creates.
yes, and we just simply do not weigh the consequences of it, and we just keep using them left, right. So this aspect, when I was interacting with them, you have to excuse me for my affinity for symbolism. I keep this keeps happening to me in my observations, that I see them, I am interacting with them, and I'm feeling inconvenient because they are not meeting you eye to eye in the communication. As mostly familiar people whom we are interacting with larger groups, only when you're looking at me, when you're nodding or doing something like that, these gestures, I get an affirmation saying that, okay, you are listening and I am connecting. And here are the people, somebody is just close their eyes and just put their neck down and all of that. And after the session was over, and I was a bit unsure who is listening, who is not listening, and those who were just seemingly dozing off were asking very profoundly pertinent questions related with the topic that we have presented.
They have evolved multi-contextual abilities.
Yeah, so
I see this with my daughters.
yeah, so they seem to be having this. They have redefined absorption or consumption in ways which are seem to be seemingly little unfamiliar for us. But what this sort of apparently looking unconscious, but absorbing something very profound or something that is being presented to them, is a very unique state. Again, our wisdom traditions and our stories have not missed this by telling us so many times when Abhimanyu was there in the womb and when he was being told about the Chakravyuha entry, and he was listening. And he is not, the only thing is he missed out on Chakravyuha exit, right? At this point in time, I feel Gen Z is like Abhimanyu Sthiti, a fetal positioning where you are extremely vulnerable to anything that can be fed to you, because your defenses of alertness are not usually the active in the Jagrat Sthiti that would be there. But in this kind of liminal state, you can outperform, cognitive abilities. The way you can partake the information and knowledge is far more surprisingly efficient. This keeps happening to us. A lot of resolutions, reconciliations in the dream states or waking up, the liminal states between the waking up and dream, and this keeps happening. So they are there, but at the same time, what is being conveyed to them? So that means good can also go and bad can also go, and undetected, and they can feel pretty strong about both. And you will see that they are very vehement when you try to point to them few things which are blatantly wrong, and there is a fallacy in that. But their subjective association, the way they have received this information, has steeped into their identity. Am I making sense? Like so much so that they have received it in a state of acceptance without any alert, critical way of looking at it. It's become part of it. So as soon as you point out, but there is a problem with this, this particular approach, they feel quite possessive about letting go of that idea, and they don't mind become judgmental about you, saying that, oh, you are being very biased, you discriminate and you do these things. This has been my limited experience, in that sense. I don't, maybe you can correct, and the audience or the larger audience would know it, but this has been my limited experience with this. So coming to that, this is the nature of the psychological structure right now. Things are happening at the consumption, the shifts, and all of this is happening in states of not full jagrat and awareness, or no sense of what we are familiar to some extent as critical thinking. Alertness is absent.
No, I think I wanted to actually expand on this, and thank you for bringing this idea of the liminal transitory phases that we are in. And one of the trends that we're seeing, while there is a cultural trend of yearning for spiritual experiences, a very, I would, in my personal opinion, a disturbing trend has also been the pathologizing of the individual using what sounds like psychological literature and uh, terms and labels. In fact, there is serious research happening on this about how the inflation of labels has started generating the pathologies themselves. You use the word narcissism, right? Wherever I travel as well, and I'm seeing a lot of people carrying these books, the dark triad, narcissist. So there is this identification and also imposition of labels very quick. All relational discomfort or all the comfort of self evolution that you spoke about, where it becomes difficult as you move closer to the subject, the idea of being able to look at the root cause becomes difficult. It is almost as if we have a vocabulary to obfuscate that now, which is produced by the by the professional fraternity in that sense. So how do we look at this? Because in a way, this is also battle of knowledge systems. In that sense, there are knowledge systems that are telling you viveka, buddhi, ahankara, chitta, manas. They are knowledge systems that are generating this seemingly sophisticated, but actually some kind of excuses for you to either exonerate yourself or impose a label on somebody else. How should we look at this?
So, in one of my, I think probably few years ago, I would also have a bit of a skewed um, inference about the Western psychology, psychotherapy. I'm not imputing that you also have it, but probably in my assessment, I used to feel that they are focusing so much on pathology and that they have nothing more to offer from a psychology perspective.
The recognition of this problem is also coming from Western psychology.
Yes, they're also saying that. They're also saying that. No, what I'm coming to is that in my own little bit of exposure and study, because that is a field which is I am personally more interested in, especially because someone like Sri Aurobindo had called all yoga is nothing but practical psychology. He makes a big statement like that. So I have very early affiliation to understanding psychology, psychological perspectives, and all of that. And Sri Aurobindo has also made some very poignant observations on early developments in the fields of psychology.
He looks at history itself as psychology.
So he has made those observations, and what I have seen is that psychology as a field itself, as a Western study, has quite a bit to offer of their own understanding, how they have come to their conclusions about what is psyche, what constitutes self, and all of that. And within that, they also have articulated at various points in time some utilizing these insights for more integral development or integrative psychology. This is something that comes. Whether we want to affiliate that word only to Sri Aurobindo or allow them to articulate it in their own measure.
Is the same.
Yeah. So what has happened, as soon as they have seen various layers of psyche, let's say subconscious, conscious, unconscious, or whatever they want to define as, or then you have other versions of psychology later on, they have identified various facets of the being, or the psyche, and they say that how do we bring it more cohesively together? What is the healthy expression of unifying it or coherence? This is the articulation that they make. But paisa and monetization comes from pathologizing. This is where it comes. This is where I would say poisoning.
Yeah. The structure itself creates the
Yeah, so
incentive.
the alluding point is poisoning. What is the incentive of poisoning? That is where it is. So there are two ways to look at it. Is that any kind of interventions that you would introduce in the West, which could possibly come from, say, our wisdom traditions from India, let's say, Bharatiya traditions, we can introduce Ayurveda. Ayurveda is not accepted in the West. You cannot practice Ayurveda in, say, any of, as far as I know, any of the Western countries, and especially in US, though it is not identified as a science itself. Scientifically, it is not rigorous as per them. So they have a whole industry of cosmetics related Ayurveda, and through that they go and partake the benefits of Ayurveda if they are practicing Ayurveda in.
Although in clinical, some of the clinical methods now they're trying to integrate, but absolutely, it's not with technology.
Yeah, they're just looking at turmeric, ashtagandha, and all of those things, and they are not able to deny the benefits which are scientifically also proved. That is that apart, but it is going to put the whole of pharmacy industry in threat. So you just do simple search on the growing trends of economy, the $1 billion that are coming in. So therefore, if you are not introducing this sort of systems which have a bit of system oriented, holistic oriented approaches to the health, then you have a way of managing your anxieties and all of that by doing things like yoga and well-being. That also has been, more than anything else, has been whatever the yoga has been distorted, presented in whatever way, but still there are people who get benefited immensely in this. What I am alluding to is that there is incentivization for emphasis on pathologizing in the discourse, and therefore moving more towards psychiatric drugs and again feeding into the pharmacology and pharmacy, rather than enabling and empowering an individual to figure out their means and mechanisms to self-heal in the process. Ours has been a culture of self-healing, but you put a colonial lens on ourselves and look at the lack of medical practitioners vis-a-vis the ratio of the patients. As soon as you bring those metrics, you can easily say that we are gone. We are like not at all evolved. But that's not the case, because various gradations of healing mechanisms and the knowledge systems of the healing are still even very vibrantly available at a household level, and people would still make use of them very easily. Unless I think a lot of urban spaces we are missing, and we are not having that wisdom anymore to the access. So this emphasis on pathologizing, emphasis on this articulation on narcissism, on various traumas, on depressions, and all of this has now penetrated even the urban space in India. Has penetrated, and it's very much so. There is no detection mechanism for this. There is no vivek of understanding whether this is poison or not, first of all, in the first place. Yeah, it's because it has a wheel of goodness intended towards you, but within that wheel, that what you can see is that there is the intention is poisonous, and so then you don't have the mechanism for detection, and then you are going ahead and consuming unrestrained, and you are also participating in the poisonous system in that sense. So what it does very interestingly is a lot of this articulation about narcissism and all of this is extensive articulation. I would say you are eulogizing darkness in a way, or very eloquent articulation of darkness. Let me put it that way, and makes it this vocabulary makes it so attractive to our people that they are speaking about exactly what I am experiencing. You would never say that as soon as Ayurvedic practitioner is making an assessment of your system and your situation, your Vata, Pitta type, or this and this is happening, your willingness to associate with that
it's an aesthetic preference.
It is little less, as opposed to if you are suddenly told that there is this pattern, which results into this kind of typology or this kind of a situation.
And they have fantastic explanatory power at that level.
There is no doubt, and that's why I say that ability to eloquently articulate darkness is not equivalent to having the ability to show the light to the darkness.
So important.
Yeah, this is something standard I keep telling across all the time, and this is applicable even in the spiritual practices and all of that. So this is where the problem is. We are enamored, we are attracted to this articulation, And the only way you can counter is to have equally compelling articulation coming from the traditional sense or the traditional wisdom, and be able to articulate exactly that. And that is where I am saying that uh, Indic way, Dharmic way is not, it's not, don't go into, there is one way to look at it, how we look at Manas and how they look at Manas and all of that, that aspect is there. Let that go on. But whole lot of articulation, what they are doing, we also have, we can articulate equally, or even better in our sense. So largely speaking, what I'm saying is that the genesis point of the modern day psychology, if you put it at the doorstep of Sigmund Freud, who is important. There are also earlier people, who have done it. He called it psychoanalytics, and then you have Adler, working with him, and he brought his own flavor of psychology to it. Then Carl Jung, who was also his disciple, and they had differences of opinion. And little that I have understood of it, while articulating subconscious and unconscious and all of that, Sigmund Freud refused to accept that there is any structures embedded within it. There is any structure to unconscious or subconscious, which is what Carl Jung would say that no, there is something. So that turns into from psychoanalytics to analytical psychology, and then from there comes structural psychology, where you are able to identify archetypal structures, that unconscious is not some random amorphous thing. The energies there are moving in channels which are deeply edged over evolutionary typologies. So therefore, which is what they would call archetypes and all of that. And they are speaking about it, and once they are articulating all of this, their proximity to us is increasing.
Yes, Carl Jung, of course, has had.
Yeah, so because they have also spent enough time
spent
in our
some time, yes,
in our circles, and the moment the proximity is increasing, we can easily take advantage of it and articulate the same set of things in our way, and say that very much we are, this has been embedded and said in this way. And I feel we will overcome that superficial challenge of attraction of articulation by presenting insights from our own knowledge systems and the knowledge corpus. And we can overcome this. I have specific examples. I have written elaborately on it. I think
you will share.
Yeah,
that,
you can share it with the audience. Some examples I have shared in that way, that you can very subtly articulate from the Dharmic point similar patterns or similar understandings what they are trying to make. And however, there are foundational differences where
versus light versus dark.
So they are like they are very they cannot escape. Their epistemic knowledge has to be enshrined in the materialism. So it eventually it boils down to brains, the frontal cortex and medulla oblongata and these things. That is where this form of consciousness in this zone is there, that zone is there. And we are far more at ease in going into the non-materiality, as the causality. They would shiver to do it even now.
Yeah, because of their experience with religion, which is historic.
And also you would find this difficulty assailing, inflicting someone like Carl Jung, where most of his knowledge is very revelatory in nature, by the way, is documented in books like Red Book, and in where he is, it's like a being is talking to him, from the realm of unconscious, collective unconscious or whatever, and revealing. That is the reason the qualitative nature of those revelations seems so very detailed, and there is no deniability to that aspect. But he very much says that all of my wisdom where I have articulated on alchemy and all of that has come from a revelatory knowledge like this, but I cannot say it this out loud in the Western space. So here you have somebody who is an psychologist or psychiatrist and psychotherapist having a problem of schizoid behavior, because he cannot express the authentic way of receiving it. And our knowledge systems have the tenacity to check the validity of the revelatory power. We don't
both
deny.
Accept and validate.
We do not deny saying that, oh no, only ours is revelatory power. You are just cooking up your thing. No, everybody with psyche would have revelatory, possibility for the revelatory. what is the quality of it? How much of it is mixed up with your own ideas, conditionings, and all of these things come up. So this is because of our long standing familiarity with the concepts of samskaras, and the how the conditionings work in the space of mental conditionings.
Epigenetics also.
Yeah, all of this comes into picture. So I'm saying that we can, right now probably there are very few who can very confidently speak about all of this, but we have that knowledge enshrined, that we can look at these Western perspectives and make our own validations and judgments and assess the maturity of their models, and all of that.
So this is actually an insight not just about a particular discipline, but it is also an insight about the temperament that we need to carry in conducting the civilizational discourse and dialogue overall. Right? What you are pointing to is that understand, don't deny, because ultimately that is what is proximate to them. That you have to be able to articulate it in relatable terms, in making sure that they are able to identify themselves with the knowledge system, which is talking to them personally. It's not just abstract, or it's not just a rule book. This is also, in a way, what you had mentioned about how do we present the perspective of Shastras, for example, right? Or how do you look at the civilizational, political, national discourse? All of it also seems to be sort of coalescing around the wisdom temperament that you need to carry to be comfortable with the new, to be anchored in what is stable. But, and you mentioned this in personal conversations, that nature and Godhead are far beyond your conception, like how you talk about Purusha Sukta in that sense, right? They are not to be measured by your intellect or your knowledge. Something that is above it, despite all of this knowledge, is still a possibility for the divine. So we end with bowing down to Prakriti and surrendering everything back to her. Jai Ma. Thank you, sir.